And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there already in the ideas room. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, a day of big announcements. And, of course, the JFK records were supposed to all come out today, and they didn't, but they did release some, and we're going to get into that. Of course, the National Archives and the Biden administration weren't the only ones making hay with big announcements. Oddly enough, Trump got in on it.
Mm-hmm.
And he announced there was, this big announcement he was going to make, and they rolled out this weird superhero theme, which we're going to get into. But he made some interesting speeches today about this anti-censorship push. That's going to be a major theme going into 2023. And watch the sparks fly all around on every side. Of course, we've been suffering under extreme repression of freedom of speech. These are just the types of things that President Kennedy opposed and made clear in many speeches that freedom of speech was fundamentally American. And any attempts to suppress that voice were decidedly un-American, which I heartily agree with. And we were faced with that, of course, with the COVID op and with a number of political shenanigans that we've been watching. But the Kennedy records in particular, these records were mandated to be released by 2017. It was all in response to this major bill that came about in 1992. And in 1992, in response to the JFK movie coming out, whipping up a fervor of people because all these facts were laid out from the Jim Garrison books. And it was a story that just hadn't been told. So that got Congress into a real frenzy, and they said, okay, we'll release everything, and we'll allow a civilian group to review the records, and they'll work with the CIA to see what can be released in relation to the president's assassination on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. Now, the official story was that one lone gunman did it and got off a lucky shot and magic bullets, all kinds of bizarre things, fantasy things going on there in Dealey Plaza. And it also allowed for the fact that no one else was involved, and certainly not the Central Intelligence Agency. As a matter of fact, Alan Dulles, who was in charge of the Central Intelligence Agency until President Kennedy fired him, was in charge of all intelligence leads on the Warren Commission, and many call the Warren Commission, for that reason, the Dulles Commission, because if you're in charge of the intelligence leads, well, intelligence is what you need to solve the crime.
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. Everyone is saying that the audio is a little garbled. Is there anything that we can do to correct that?
Well, we've got the audio signal here. I'm going to guess that that's just an anomaly. Keep it rolling here, as it were. Why don't you give me a little volume?
Okay. Yeah, they're saying there's a little bit of a distortion, an echo.
Well,
it says both of us are garbled.
Interesting. Well, that's probably just something.
It says it's not terrible.
Interesting. Well, it's probably.
Are we loud enough, guys?
Yeah, we certainly, everything here on the mix board is just fine, so I'm not sure what would be causing that exactly. And it looks here, from looking at the stats and all that we're doing okay. So, my suggestion is we keep on rolling, keep on trucking.
Okay.
And these are the types of things that tend to work themselves out. But I do want to make clear that in relation to the records, there actually been a number of record releases and investigations and demands for those things. So we're looking initially at the Warren Commission demand, for records. This investigation, which was largely a whitewash, that we moved along into the 70s, and there were a number of investigations like the Rockefeller Commission, the Pike Commission, and the Church Committee, which looked into atrocities by the Central Intelligence Agency. The only other thing I can suggest when it comes to looking around at those different investigations is that when you get to the end of the 70s, you have the House Assassination Committee. And this is very interesting because the House Assassination Committee gives you a different verdict than the Warren Commission. And so the actual last word on the assassination was probable conspiracy. So that's kind of something important for us to hold as a benchmark, that a House Intelligence Committee looked into the Kennedy assassination for 3 years and found a probable conspiracy, and then referred it to the Justice Department, and the Reagan administration took over and did not a whole lot, unfortunately. Everyone, you're here watching this JFK special report on the Dark Journalist show, and, I guess we started off with a little bit of static, but,
Do you have 2 tabs open? That could be the issue.
2 tabs?
Yeah.
What's that all about?
I don't know. Somebody said that. Do you have
No.
Okay.
No, the audio goes through an entirely different mix
Okay.
system, the Rode mix system, so I'm actually, can't he start over? Boy, that's something
A
else.
lot of people are having a hard time with the sound.
Interesting. Well,
Do you wanna stop and come back in? Start over?
yeah, actually, that's not something that we can do.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd have to restart the whole shebang. And,
Okay.
that could be a little
Now they're
dynamic.
saying it just got better.
Yeah, isn't that
Okay.
interesting? Well, you never know, with the signal here, but in any case, my kind of general impression is to always roll and not to, get sidetracked, as it were. Because after all, if this were like 2015, this would be incredible audio. So you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the special report on the JFK assassination records, and I will restart some of what I was saying there. So basically, we had the original investigation in 1964, which was largely just a cover-up to put Lee Harvey Oswald there as the scapegoat. Oswald himself had been working for a right-winger and a former FBI chief in New Orleans in the summer before the assassination, and infiltrating communist groups and student groups that had leanings towards communism. That doesn't sound like somebody who's pro-communist. And the leader of that group, as we've pointed out many times on this show, was in charge and developed the UFO file for the FBI. That's Guy Bannister. And Bannister's important because when we get to some of the later breakthrough investigations of people like Judge Jim Garrison, we're looking at someone who had worked with Bannister and knew him quite well. And then when he found out that Oswald had worked for Bannister, he was like, wait a minute, they're saying this guy's a communist and a left winger and, this fanatic who lived in the Soviet Union. How is he working for this ultra-right FBI chief? This doesn't make any sense. So when he investigated that, a Colorado businessman came to visit him and said, I want to help you with your investigation, put money behind it and all the rest. So he said, this is great. And the guy's name is Mr. Miller. And there was a scene that was shot with Mr. Miller, which is directly out of Garrison's book, On the Trail of the Assassins. And interestingly enough, that scene was cut from the movie, but it's actually the core of the entire...
It is the best scene in the movie.
It's the core of the case, interestingly enough. But so what happened, in essence, was that Mr. Miller said, you don't belong in this cheap kind of DA of New Orleans job. I can appoint you to federal court, and every time Garrison went with him and said, well, look, we have a picture of a second shooter. We have this witness. We have all this stuff. He was like, very interesting. What a terrible tragedy. I can expedite you getting on the federal bench. And Garrison asked him, what would I have to do? And he said, you have to give up your investigation. And so Garrison rolled with him a little to see where he was coming from. And so Mr. Miller at one point said, how many, what kind of resources have you been using to research this and get into all of the different angles and figure out that it wasn't really what the Warren Commission said it was? And Garrison said, well, 3 or 4 part-time investigators. And Miller was shocked. And he said, wait a minute. How on earth have you been able to get into Guy Bannister's operation using just 3 or 4 part-time investigators? Instantly, Miller, who was trying to bribe Garrison with a judgeship to get off this case, knew that the linchpin was Bannister. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the shadow and the piece that was picked up on by Garrison, what he actually discovered was that there was an aerospace group behind the assassination. That group is called Exprotect, and that's what really needs to be brought out in the records. And that's why a very interesting development is happening, regardless of the government stonewalling and releasing largely fluff records. And some of those records, I've talked to some of the really kind of top researchers on the JFK front. Some of those files that came out today already came out last year with the same redactions. So they're saying, hey, look, here's the JFK records. They're less redacted. And then they look at them and they have the same redactions. And they're like, oh, we released 12,000 files today. But a lot of it is mainly gobbledygook. Now, what's key are two series of records, and they have not released them. They're both held by the Central Intelligence Agency. One are the files on the Garrison investigation, because it leads directly to this Exprotect group, and two are the files on George Joannides. Joannides is a linchpin, and there are, in fact, two files from Joannides that get into that. And we're going to get into that here tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here in this special report. We'll be with you for, say, about an hour going over this. And I was very happy to hear that some records were getting released. In any case, since all of this was supposed to be taken care of by law, October 26th, 2017. So, Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. John Howard is asking, so they released everything but 3%?
No. And it's interesting. This is the way that they kind of like to put this out there. But they've been releasing since the 90s records related to the JFK assassination. And now a number of those records have been released, but the core CIA files are the ones that we've been after. So let's say that in terms of core files, what we've wanted of the 100% core files, there's only 7% that have been released. 93% of the actual JFK records that people want, that is what the CIA knew about Oswald, if the CIA was involved in the assassination. The whole thing about the CIA, those are the records people want. Things about, did Kennedy travel to Atlanta 3 months before the assassination? Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of records like that, but they don't mean anything. So of the core records, we only have 7%, 93% held behind the iron guard of secrecy there with the Central Intelligence Agency. There's a reason for that, and it goes back to the aerospace group. Now, in conversation at the end of his investigation of Clay Shaw, Jim Garrison came forward, and he's talking with the editor of Ramparts magazine, Ned Hinkle. And Ned Hinkle has this in his autobiography, so anyone can look that up. He was the editor of Ramparts magazine, which was kind of like Rolling Stone in the 60s. And Garrison said, I need you. I'm taking a chance calling you because they're tapping the phone and everything, but I need you to put this down. We were wrong in our initial look at this, looking at Texas oil men. What it actually is an aerospace corridor in the military-industrial complex in combination with intelligence forces. And he made him write down Boeing and Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. Those were the three defense contractors involved in the assassination. Now, we recently on a program tracked the General Dynamics aspect and how that set up Area 51, Pine Gap in Australia. So there was a reason on that piece. But the actual Exprotect aerospace angle and why Kennedy was assassinated was because he was all in on this and he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, because what they were setting up was a gigantic space grid to control the globe from space. This was their goal, the whole point. And this program does go very far back, right into the Nazi regime. And in fact, Kennedy became aware that in our space program, we were utilizing those very same Nazis, but that they came over with the same Marshall philosophy. And what Kennedy may have or may not have realized was that when he was leaning into smashing the CIA structure, he was smashing into that nest of former Nazis and this runaway, breakaway aerospace aspect. Now, this gets into intelligence because this corridor is very hard to define, but if you go into the UFO file, you can do it. And that's the corridor between the defense contractors on the aerospace side and the intelligence agencies on the other. One is a private-public piece, so they're associated with the government. That is, I'm a defense contractor for the government, but I'm also a private company. And the other is at the behest of the government, the Central Intelligence Agency. But the Central Intelligence Agency serves a larger structure. Remember, it was born out of an S&C law firm. That's where Dulles came from. And New York at that point was the jumping off point for international finance. That's what we're talking about when we're getting into the Central Intelligence Agency. So its actual function was to gather intelligence for the president. What it turned into was using the American military might and presence in the world for specific interests, moneyed interests, oil interests, aerospace interests. That's what the push and pull became. And Kennedy, unlike a lot of presidents, was very aware of those business forces. His dad was so deep in business. And, we have to remember, let's take this history back to Boston for a minute, which is where the Kennedys came from. Joe Kennedy was working on a port during World War I in East Boston, and they were making there armaments and things for World War I. And who did he meet there but someone who was an assistant secretary of the Navy, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is, a long, long history. Into 1918, you really start to get the essence of what the Kennedys knew. And as Joe Kennedy moves up through that Wall Street world, doing a lot of very kind of, shady Wall Street stuff, he moves into all kinds of positions to the point where he becomes a Democratic power broker by 1929 when the Depression happens. When Roosevelt gets in the early 30s, he appoints him to head up the new SEC, which is to control all this crazy short selling that created the bubble and then burst, and we got the Depression. So Joe Kennedy knows all about business, but the other thing that he knows all about is all about Hollywood. And in fact, he owns his own studios, he owns his own theaters, and he has his hands in real estate, alcohol, shipping. This guy is through it all. So his sons, when they're coming up, they share in all that knowledge. And when we get to Jack, he in particular is particularly book smart. He absorbs these things, and he's a speed reader too. So, one of the things that Jack doesn't want to do is go into politics, interestingly enough. And his brother Joe is meant to go into politics and take on this role. Joe will die during World War II in a secret mission. And John will become his father's kind of main object. The father himself was planning to run against Roosevelt, interestingly enough, in 1940. But in 1938, he made some comments that seemed like they were wishy-washy against fascism. And then during the Battle of Britain, he starts to speak in a fashion which would suggest that he is very pessimistic about England's chances in the war. And Roosevelt yanks him, and he's thought of as an appeaser. And this is very hard. Joe basically realizes, I'm shot, I'll never be president, but I'm going to funnel all of that interest and, that focus I have to be president into my sons. And in fact, it's John who picks up the mantle. But John also has a unique friendship with the first defense secretary of the United States, and that is James Forrestal. Forrestal is a Catholic like Kennedy is, and they develop a very interesting friendship. And what happens is Forrestal says, I'm going to take you after World War II. I'm going to take you to see the ruins in Berlin. You can write one of your stories. You're such a great journalist now. And Kennedy has just written a book called Why England Slept, which is all about the rise of Hitler and why England didn't do anything about it and this whole thing. So his trajectory is actually to be a writer, interestingly enough. And but when he's over there, and there are all these pictures of him with Forrestal. Forrestal, as we learn later, becomes part of the MJ-12 group overlooking the UFO file. He will be pushed out of a window at Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1949, just a short period of time into being Secretary of Defense. They said it was exhaustion, and there's a number of very good book and analyses on what happened to Forrestal, actually. But in any case, the best explanation, he wanted to share the UFO file. That was a big problem. And so the number of people, if you go through Kennedy's life, that shared the UFO file aspect with him show up dramatically. And Eisenhower is another one who does this. So Kennedy, when he goes into the White House, knows a great deal about the UFO file. This becomes very important. And I have to stress this, that, so many of the deep state researchers want to solve the Kennedy assassination. And, so many of the people who study the UFO file want to, get disclosure and all that. neither group can get it because they don't work with each other's information. So on the deep state side, you've got a lot of people, and we're going to talk about some of them tonight, incredible people, but they won't work with the UFO file, and that is a possibility at all. So when we look at a Washington Post reporter who discovers a secret CIA agent that no one knew about and puts him on the record, and as a matter of fact, he wasn't even included in the trove of documents that were to come out because no one knew the guy existed. But he was the psychological operations manager of the Oswald project, which is absolutely important. And he was our top psychological warfare officer. His name is George Joannides, and he is one of the major keys to the Kennedy assassination. We're going to get into him right now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is a JFK Assassination Files special. There were some interesting things that came out we're going to report upon. I'm going to be looking at those files all weekend, but it appears to me that there's a couple of things that we can extrapolate out from what they released. Of course, they left out the most important stuff and the files that researchers have been demanding for years, for decades. And there's 44 files around George Joannides and the CIA operation to create Oswald. Those are the files that need to come out, not, so-and-so went to the dentist in Atlanta, in the summer. And they did that. They actually had a thing in there about Oswald's, how often he did laundry.
Wow.
So, they thrive on minutia when it comes to these things. We just have to take that for granted. Before we get into Joannides, and by the way, there's someone who is still living who can answer a lot of these questions. And I really want to get this across, that either this person should come forward or Congress should subpoena them to get this information out. And he might not like being put on the spot, but he said some very interesting things before, so maybe we can get him on the record. But he's about 90 years old now, so we'll see if he will. So the basic glow from today, everyone was saying, Newsweek and all these others, the secret JFK assassination files are finally here. And the general buzz was, well, President Biden couldn't let out some records because of national security, but here's all this other stuff. And that was basically the name of the game. So the general take, for example, Newsweek, here's the CIA spokesperson on why they couldn't release the CIA records, the majority of them. CIA spokesperson said in comments shared with Newsweek that the agency is committed to the JFK Act's goal of ensuring maximum transparency with respect to the government records concerning President Kennedy's assassination. By the way, it's not the spirit of the JFK Act, it's a law. The Central Intelligence Agency is in violation of the law ever since 2017 because the records had 25 years to come out by law. That's a congressional law. It's been passed, signed off on by the president. So the conversation about this should be over, but here we go, more fluff.
Wait, let me interrupt you for a second. So are there lawsuits to get them to produce this?
Now the Mary Farrell Foundation has a lawsuit, and we do get into their comments next. Okay. So you're right on the beam here. The agency worked in close collaboration with the National Archives to review the files over the last year and release thousands of additional documents in full. Yeah, fluff documents. The spokesperson said other documents were released with fewer redactions, and no documents remain fully redacted or withheld in their entirety. The spokesman reiterated Burns, who's the director now, Director Burns' previous statement that all of the CIA information directly related to the Kennedy assassination was previously released, and said, as of Thursday, 95% of all CIA documents related to the assassination have been released in their entirety. This is actually such a bold-faced lie. And the core files, the one that we're looking for, again, 93% of those have not been released. Only 7% of them have. As for Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who fatally shot Kennedy, the spokesperson said, I'm not aware of any documents known to be directly related to Oswald that have not already been made part of the collection. Oh yeah? How about the Joannides files, which are completely secret, and he's the one who created the Oswald project? Do you think that those records might be related? Okay, conspiracy theories about the assassination have continued to spread. All those terrible conspiracy theories, the ones that use facts. Some theorists have questioned whether the CIA or the government had any connection with Oswald. Well, they don't have to question it because we have records of CIA people tracking Oswald. And now There are records that are going to be coming out in January, which are related to a lawsuit. And the idea is they're going to show and expose the CIA directly created the Oswald project. Now, the official word, are you ready? CIA never engaged Oswald. The spokesperson said CIA information regarding Oswald, including Oswald's visit to Mexico City, was included in prior releases. There's no new information on this topic in the 2022 release. Well, that's the whole reason for the 2022 release, is to release the Joannides Oswald files. If you don't do that, then the whole thing is just a PR exercise. Okay. President Biden postpones disclosure of some files. President Joe Biden said he's releasing most, but not all, of the 16,000 records related to the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, I want to point this out. If I say to you, I have 16,000 records, each record may contain up to 10,000 documents. So, in fact, if I say to you, I have 16,000 records, and each one has approximately somewhere 5,000 to 10,000 documents each, what number of documents are we actually talking about? So it's an easy figure to just float around and say, well, there's only 16,000 left. Don't worry about it. This significant disclosure reflects my administration's commitment to transparency and will provide the American public with greater insight and understanding of the government's investigation into this tragic event, Stepford Biden said. Thursday afternoon, agencies in the National Archives did, however, identify a limited number of records that contain information that should continue to be classified, and Biden agrees. Okay, so now this other group, and that there was a false start before the records actually came out, and it was by the Mary Farrell Foundation, which has long been collecting records in relation to the JFK assassination, and they have a large media library and all these different things that people can get into. Now, their sentiment, they've made Jefferson Morley, I think he's vice president now, and he is the Washington Post reporter who found Joannides. He found out about Joannides, who was a secret operative inside the CIA structure who created the Oswald project. Now, he wasn't, Joannides was not on record. We didn't know anything about him until Morley found him. So that's a very significant discovery. They did a press junket themselves at the Washington Press Club, and this was interesting too. Because once they did it, all these articles came out. Did you notice this? About a week before this actual release, all these articles were buzzing about, hey, you know, there's this incredible new information about the CIA and Oswald. But that wasn't the official stuff. That was just Jeff Morley talking at a press thing about his research. So they did a weird crisscross there in case people weren't paying attention, so that people would think, oh yeah, you know, they released these records, we're all set. But when the actual records release came up about today, no Oswald, no CIA, forget all about it. So they were able to do this weird two-step. And those are the types of operations that we watch that go on in the media with these types of releases. Okay. Now, here's the Mary Farrell Foundation's position on this. The foundation says the timing of their lawsuit is coincidental to Trump's fight over classified records with the Justice Department and the National Archives, an agency that's seldom in the news, but now plays a central role in the investigation of records stored at Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida after he left office. JFK assassination historian David Talbot, who wrote a quite remarkable book called The Devil's Chessboard about the Central Intelligence Agency, but he's a Trump critic. He sees an irony in the two cases. Quote, they decided to pillory Trump over this issue because he's a political enemy, but they're guilty of violating records laws themselves with the JFK Records Act. Trump took documents the federal government owned, but they're sitting on documents that belong to the American people. Exactly. And I put this across when it came to the Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon thing, where they said, hey, we've got this secret UFO stuff and we just grabbed it out of the government and here it is, you know. Well, obviously, if classification rules were real, like the ones they busted Trump over at Mar-a-Lago, then they would have grabbed Elizondo, CIA agent, and Mellon, and intelligence veteran, you know. So come on. This is just a selective game of whenever they want to go after somebody, they'll have a good reason. But I think it's an interesting point that he makes here. Interestingly enough, a spokesman for Trump declined to comment. There's a weird thing here about Trump and these records. And again, when he showed up today saying, I'm going to make a big announcement, and it was on the same day as the JFK records, you have to wonder in that two-step around Mar-a-Lago if he isn't trying to scare that structure that's trying to basically put him in prison by saying, you don't know what files I have. Maybe I have copies of those JFK files that you're hiding. I've pointed out the conversation that took place between Judge Napolitano and President Trump as President Trump was leaving office. And this is when Napolitano and Trump were still friends. And he's been on record now, Judge Napolitano, who's been all over the place, for years as this libertarian judge and celebrated in all these legal places. He was a commentator on Fox News, and he's very well known. And so he goes into this conversation that he had with Trump before he left office, and he said, why didn't you let out the presidential records around the JFK assassination? You said you would. And Trump said, I can't do it. And he said, what do you mean you can't treat the American people like children? You have to do this. People are counting on you. And he said, you don't understand. If you saw what was in there, Andrew, you couldn't release it. Basically, it would destroy everything. That's what Trump said about those records. Interestingly enough, there's never been a bigger dance around deep state records in the United States government than the JFK records. I'm inclined to believe that it was Bobby Kennedy right after the Kennedy assassination who somehow put something on the record inside of that JFK archive. And that's why we have the problem getting these records, because the CIA realizes that it couldn't rub out whatever it is he left behind. And Bobby Kennedy was just the type, because immediately after the assassination, he summoned the head of the CIA, and they were in conference for 2 hours. So there's something going on there with those records that Trump, looking at them, said, oh my God. And that's about as close of a glimpse as we're going to get to it, because Napolitano and Trump were friends, and Trump was talking to him off the cuff. And Napolitano says to this day, I want to know what it was that he was looking at, but he doesn't know. I'm going to get into what that most likely is. A little more on Mary Farrell. Okay. Oh, here's the other thing that the CIA said. Now, the new government position is agencies have until May 1st, 2023 to review the remaining redactions in the records and determine if they should be disclosed to the public. Continued postponement after that date will only happen if necessary to protect against harm, military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the embarrassment of the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating their own president. I mean, that's kind of a problem. And it would be the end of the Central Intelligence Agency. So you can see why they're holding on for dear life with it. Nonetheless, on the record, they are responsible for the entire Oswald operation, their entire cover-up. It's on them. And this is why we're in this situation, is they're covering up. But they're also controlling, because even now the Central Intelligence Agency has a lead role in our media. They have a lead role in our entertainment. They have a lead role in Homeland Security. Basically everything is going through this funnel of the Central Intelligence Agency. And guess what? When you get into the space programs and Space Force and all the rest of it, all the people are intelligence people. So, the UFO threat piece and that whole thing run by the CIA. We had a guy over here, Avi Loeb, in his astrophysics lab, which is, 5 minutes from me here in Harvard. And this guy started out and said, I'm doing the Galileo project, and I'm going to put this whole thing on the record about UFOs. I'm a Harvard professor, and I'm going to make sure that this all gets out. And then he puts together this group of advisors, and you got CIA person after CIA person, and the CIA does not want to share the UFO file with the public, nor do they want to share the Kennedy records. Kennedy records are 60 years old. If the CIA was clean in relation to it, they'd release the whole thing. That's just a matter of fact. Now I'm going to show you what they're hiding. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep here tonight on the JFK assassination, with you here on a Thursday because they released the files today. I want to remind everyone that we're going to have a very exciting interview for you tomorrow night. So make sure you set it on your clock at 8 p.m. I'm not going to say who.
I already told them.
You won't be disappointed. Well, you're not supposed to do that. So penalty point 1 for Olivia. But what I will say is that that's a very exciting interview indeed. Okay, We're moving along. How are you doing out there?
Good. Sammy wants to know, I wonder why Bobby didn't immediately go after the deep state after JFK's assassination.
Well, I mean, Bobby was Attorney General. What did he do? He ran for Senate immediately because the FBI knew, oh, we don't have to cooperate with him anymore. His brother's dead, and LBJ was his bitter enemy. So you don't really have those resources in the government to do anything. But he continued investigating all those years that he was senator. And after he'd investigated for 4 years, what does he say? I'm going to run for president. Well, the best revenge is to institute President Kennedy's policies as president, which he was going to do. And he was assassinated, but not until LBJ got out of the race, because LBJ wasn't going to sit around and say, you know what, I'm not going to sit here and, be the recipient of 2 Kennedy deaths. That's going to look too suspicious. People are going to look at my role in it. And, I'm already looking dicey enough. One thing I think that's important to remark on also when we think about LBJ is that LBJ blackmailed himself onto the ticket, which is very interesting if you get into it. And the Kennedys didn't want him on there. This is where he pulled strings with J. Edgar Hoover and others. And he was going to, according to Kennedy's secretary, drop some very personal things about John Kennedy. And he had already used very dirty tactics, breaking into Kennedy's doctors' files and trying to, get any dirt medically that he could on JFK. So LBJ was, just a dirty operator, and that's what the deep state needed. However, here's a weird fate twist about LBJ. There's 2 things, actually. One, if he hadn't been in there, then the Kennedys may not have carried Texas, and so Kennedy may not have become president. So there may have been a reason in the great, scheme of things for LBJ to be there. The other thing is that after he left office in 1969, he gave an interview with Walter Cronkite where he said, well, I don't believe the Warren Commission, and I don't believe that Oswald acted alone. As soon as the interview was over, he called the news office and said, don't run it. But we still have the footage of him saying it. So he wanted himself on the record. There's another twist with LBJ, and it comes up next year. You want to know what it is? It's an X letter, and it's at the LBJ library. It's sitting there, and it is 75 pages in a letter. And the letter is just X, and it's not to be opened.
What do you mean the letter is just X? That's what it says on the...
It's the X letter.
Okay.
That's what it is. It's definitely related to the X technology.
Wow.
And this entire subject. Now, here's what he said. This letter to be released 50 years after my death. Well, he died in January of 1973. What is 50 years after his death? It's January of 2023. The LBJ library, where are you? Are you getting ready? Are you going to block that the way the CIA blocked the Joannides records? This is interesting. For years, historians have wondered, what's in that? And right after Nixon died, they were so curious that someone convinced the person who was headed up the LBJ library to open it. And he opened and looked at 2 pages, and they were immediately classified. So whatever it is hot stuff. And, I don't think it has anything to do with Nixon. I think it's related directly to this. And I've put this on the record before that there's a number of stealth archives all over the place. And stealth archives is very simple. It's like these JFK records. We know the Joannides records exist. We know the CIA holds them. We know that they contain explosive information, but we can't get our hands on them. That's a stealth archive. We're aware of it, but we can't get our hands on it. Now the LBJ letter is sitting there, and I believe that they will. I think that, they're in a position to do it, but they might experience some official interference if they go to release that letter and say, well, we need to hold off for another 20 years and just, wait till these generations die off and forget about it. And then look back 100 years later and say, we were in a tough spot because it was the Cold War and the CIA had to kill Kennedy. And, this is the basic thing. But right now, as it stands, the historical book is distorted. So the reality is upside down because the same group that's operating and taking control on so many different levels, including health levels now, direct from the government, is the same power source, the covert power source that took over in 1963. Professor Peter Dale Scott calls it the first deep state revolt against the White House. That's how I think we need to look at it. All right, George Joannides, are you ready? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Before we go any further, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is what's going to keep us in touch through this incredible censorship that we've been living through. And it is remarkable the amount of shadow banning. If you search Dark Journalist on YouTube, you get one video. Let me tell you, we have something like 400 here alone, and you're going to get one. Okay, so this is the nature of that, but that's the shadow banning, and they have particularly picked out my work for this. They haven't deplatformed me as such, but you know, you just never know with these people. So the best way for us all to keep in touch is to be on that newsletter list. And basically, you get a newsletter about once a week, letting you know the incredible episodes that we have coming up for you on the X series, the remarkable interviews and documentaries and events coming up for next year. And you won't believe what's coming up for the rest of December and into January. So make sure, especially if you're new, that you're on that newsletter list. Okay. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're
Alien Scientist says Joannides hated the Kennedys along with Gordon Campbell and David Sanchez Morales. All were at the Ambassador Hotel when RFK was shot by Thane Eugene Caesar.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This was very interesting research that was done, and I think the filmmaker is Sean O'Sullivan. The problem is Joannides, it was discovered later, was not at the Ambassador. And so that was a misidentification. But Morales is, you know, one of those guys who is in that system of things. So when we go to track the people involved, we actually know some of the CIA agents' names who were involved in the program. And some of them, you know, were just lucky because, for example, the E. Howard Hunt files were not released today. There's a reason for that. E. Howard Hunt was the top CIA spy through the 50s and into the 60s. Got into some trouble in the mid-60s, and they set him up in a PR agency where he developed a friendship with one lawyer named Douglas Caddy. Douglas Caddy's been on this program. Douglas Caddy would become the Watergate lawyer because of his close friendship with E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt is a major piece to the JFK assassination. In private, E. Howard Hunt admitted before he went to prison to Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy that JFK was assassinated over the UFO file. It's clear as a bell. He said it on this program. You know, we've had him come on the program and say it now several times. The deep state community, which doesn't deal with the UFO file, doesn't know what to make of this high-level Watergate figure making this declaration. And the UFO file is too busy running around after Lou Elizondo and the fake circus disclosure. So they've both missed basically the biggest revelation on both the deep state and the UFO file side. When you bring those two things together, you get something very, very potent. And I want to talk more and more as we go forward about potency, because as I've said, a lot of these different programs, you know, and it's not to criticize them, but it is things like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson and all this stuff. It's a kind of a dumbed down reality that they do cover things now because they've realized that the public is interested in the UFO file or Atlantis or something of this nature. But they often, the conduits that they're getting to reflect, especially around the UFO thing, are all intelligence people. So you're getting a bunch of UFO, you know, CIA disinformation agents sitting there spouting off about the UFO file. This is not the way to do it. And you get that even with people who I think have good intentions, you know, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, all those people. But when they go into the UFO thing, they don't know anything about it. They haven't studied it. And they're just like, hey, I'm cool. I cover UFOs or something, you know? And so in fact, what you have is this real dichotomy where you have a big outlets who kind of spread out this low potency stuff. And then, and I can point to the X series for this very high potency, you know, media outlets giving you direct information that are completely independent from that machine and who know the topic at hand. This is a very crucial difference between those. And I think we see it very often that these people just don't know a whole lot about these topics, but they know that the public is interested. So they're like, hey, I have an Atlantis show, you know, so I'll have like a skeptic on, you know, or with the UFO file, well, you know, what is it? Oh, this Chris Mellon guy, he worked for Bush. I'll put him on. But, these are people working for the Central Intelligence Agency. They're not interested in getting the public the real truth about it. They want to promote a UFO threat because they can create a gigantic UFO defense department, which is what they're already involved in doing. They are classically disinformation, which is why they love to use that term whenever we talk about things, and say, well, we need to, really censor that public because they're talking about COVID and they're making all these, misnomers and things. That's misinformation. We're going to sanction them, and that gives us the right to shut down their conversation on the internet. It's not true. Misinformation is something that the Central Intelligence Agency is great at, and they're spreading that through the media. I mean, the media depends for their news, especially news about things that are happening overseas. Ukraine, hello. That's all Central Intelligence Agency. They write the news releases, they give it back. What's somebody at the New York Times going to do? They're under orders from their publisher to take what the Central Intelligence Agency says. We have no idea what's going on over there. And in relation to the Kennedy assassination, they just want it to fade from memory, but what's happening instead is generation to generation, it keeps picking up. They thought they'd get over it. Well, the recent poll on the JFK assassination is that 71% of the public doesn't believe the official story, and they don't believe that Oswald acted alone, i.e. the Central Intelligence Agency disinformation campaign failed. So where do you go from there? Because then the public is looking at the government, and the government doesn't look so legitimate because they're still hiding something from 60 years ago. Who's the central responsible agent that is holding those records? The National Archives and the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, if the Central Intelligence Agency isn't giving you the truth, and obviously they're not, then we shouldn't trust them in all these other areas, like getting us into a nuclear war in Ukraine, for example. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. All right. Admiral Bobby Inman, George Joannides from the Central Intelligence Agency, their top psychological warfare officer. Let's talk about them for a minute. 44 of these central important records that were supposed to be released didn't come out today, and there's a reason for that. Those records pertain directly to how the Central Intelligence Agency set up the Oswald project. And who was behind that? Let's take a look at some of these guys. First, let's get into Oswald for a minute. The many faces of Lee Oswald. It's often been pointed out that not only do we have Oswald doubles, but the actual Oswald seems to have like a twin, somebody who, acted as him, but wasn't him. And he seems to be in two places at once very often, i.e. There are people who swear that he grew up right next to them in North Dakota and they knew him quite well, but they knew him as Harvey. There are people in New York who say, no, he was in an orphanage with us. We remember him very, very well. And then there's school records of him in New Orleans. Well, guess what? There's also school records of him in Texas. So he gets around. And his story, the official story around Oswald is, he comes from a poverty-stricken family. He has a low education. He joined the Marines because he had a terrible life. Well, it's interesting because he speaks several languages. That's pretty interesting. He travels the world. He has a top security clearance for the highest priority project in the United States, the U-2, when he's at Atsugi in Japan. That's 1959. And Oswald was born in 39. So at 20 years old, he's pretty well accomplished already. He also studied at one of the major Army language training schools in California. So this is not, a run-of-the-mill person. The fact that he can go to Russia in that era, when really no Americans were in Russia, establish himself there, speak Russian so well that when he meets his wife, she thinks he's a Russian because of how well he speaks the language. Let's think about that. So, I'll pass on the multiple Oswalds for tonight, but let's face it, there's some very good information there. By the time Oswald, by the way, I will say another weird thing, which is here is Oswald in the military, and his actual height listed there is 5'9", but the corpse that they put in the funeral home and that they bury is 5'11". So that's also, a number of unusual things about that. This got so curious, the information about this, that they actually dug up the Oswald corpse in 1980. And the original person who had, handled Oswald's body and done an autopsy, his name was Paul Grudy, and he gives his own testimony. He came forward and said, well, I went and looked at the body, and then I realized that the head didn't have an autopsy scar on it, so you're going to make some kind of a mark, and you're going to know, basically that when we put him in there, he is going to basically still have that autopsy scar. And so, there's a lot of confusion about who was actually put in the grave. I'll save that for now, and we'll just go along with the idea that this was the same guy throughout. Very early on, one of the interesting things that Garrison found out about was that David Ferrie, who was in New Orleans, who was a CIA pilot who worked also for the mafia running drugs a la Barry Seal, was someone who had trained Oswald in the Civil Air Patrol. So every researcher, who was kissing up to the Warren Commission and was part of the mainstream media was saying there's no way he could have been involved in that. Finally, a picture came out showing Oswald with David Ferrie, and they were both clear there. It's clear as a bell now, and the records show that Oswald was in David Ferrie's unit when he was 15 in the Civil Air Patrol. This is how he got involved in intelligence operations in the first place. And that's pretty young. By the time Oswald is grabbed, and the whole history that we know about Oswald, he's lost severe amount of weight. He looks very stressed out, and whatever it is, the program that he's been in has been high stress. There's no question about it. Interestingly enough, Oswald develops a profile, and what they had him doing as part of an FBI operation is buying guns. So there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that Oswald was working for the FBI first, and then with the Central Intelligence Agency. And what he was doing was they put him on a program to buy guns through the mail. And then later, and they said, use this name, Alec Heidel, to do it. Later, they would tie that to, oh, he was ordering guns through the mail, and then he killed the president. So you see, they set him up with an operation first, and then they have him, with that trail that he sets up. This is the same thing that Guy Bannister does with him in New Orleans. He has him agitating on the street saying Fidel Castro is great, handing out leaflets and everything. But Garrison broke a major piece of this case when he found the address of Guy Bannister's office on one of the leaflets that Oswald was passing out. Obviously, this was an error that he made. And he found out from Bannister's secretary that Oswald actually worked right upstairs, and that he was doing all this work for Guy Bannister. So this is where the whole right wing, left wing covers that Oswald had and the story that they painted in the Warren Commission, which was total bunk. In fact, he was working for our government, and he was working to penetrate different types of operations. At a certain point, they decided this guy is pretty well set up for the patsy because we've sent him over to the Soviet Union. We've made him agitate for Castro. He'll be absolutely perfect. It'll actually create a great deal of pressure on the government to go after Russia and Cuba. This was one of those aspects, the stories that were involved, the narratives layered on top. And then later, with that story, people like LBJ could come out and say, listen, talking to the director of the Supreme Court at that time, Earl Warren, and say, you have to stick with this lie, because if you don't, we're going to get into a war with Russia and millions of people will die. So people who were upstanding, in general, like Earl Warren, and wouldn't go along with this ordinarily, they were like, well, I'll do it for my country. I'll go along with the phony lie that Oswald was the lone shooter. So that's how you get tons and tons of this. And then they, when they look back on it, they say, well, I did it because I thought that Oswald was actually a communist working for Cuba or the Soviet Union, and that would get us into World War III because he killed the president. This is the story that they floated out there. And then the story that they were able to use the media to shut up anything about Oswald was, if you get into his background, you're going to find out that he's a Fidel Castro assassin who was sent over here to kill Kennedy. None of that stuff makes any sense, because neither the Russians nor the Cubans wanted to assassinate President Kennedy. In fact, his policies were very open with both of them. And he was working on reducing tensions, reducing nuclear arms, and he wanted a joint space mission. There are letters between him and Khrushchev about going to the moon together. If anything, they would have despised conservative LBJ waiting in the wings, and they wouldn't want him elevated to the top spot. Wouldn't make any sense. So that whole thing goes out the window. There's no KGB and there's no Cuban anything involved, but they had to set up Oswald with this cover. So that's the gigantic psyop. The question is, who came up with it? The person who came up with it was George Joannides. He was the brilliant psychological warfare officer whose dad was on Wall Street and was from Greece. And in fact, they sent him over to the Athens, Greece station. If you look at Joannides' profile, he's in Asia, he's in Greece, he's in Africa. This is somebody who's a global player, and he's setting up psyops in different countries, overthrowing leaders and all the rest of it. He knows it quite well. So what he needs to do is he needs to create the perfect patsy assassin, and that's what he does with Oswald. And the records that came out today, there's only 2 records, but they actually support this quite well. Let's go into Joannides a little bit. So George Joannides is somebody who, as I said, wasn't even mentioned in Kennedy literature until the 2000s, because it was it was Jefferson Morley, who was the Washington Post reporter, who found this person out. And he did it by talking to people who were involved with a group called the DRE. And the DRE was a revolutionary group in New Orleans that wanted the overthrow of Castro. And what happened was there were all sorts of contacts between, they were run by the Central Intelligence Agency. There are all kinds of contacts between Oswald and the DRE. And what they start to do is they start creating this myth about Oswald, that Oswald is pro-Castro. They get into fights with him, and they build a profile. They even have a debate with him that's telecast in New Orleans in the summer, just before the assassination. As soon as the assassination hits, all these news stations can run this footage of Oswald defending Castro and Marxism and all that stuff. So they can instantly build this profile of Oswald. Joannides saw to it that this would happen. Now, they also learned, upon looking at his data that was available, that he was, in fact, in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. That's on record. Now, here's the interesting thing about Joannides. Joannides created the Oswald Project, a psychological operation that got us to believe that he was a leftist Marxist who killed the president. But what's also interesting is in 1978, when all these committees were coming about and the government and the CIA were again in trouble on the Oswald situations, they called him out of retirement. And they called him out of retirement and said, we need you to rescue this. You have to deal with these congressional committees and say, you know who to point them to misdirect them. And the committees said, look, to the CIA, the only thing that we want from you is that you not give us anyone who was active during the era that we're talking about, 1963. So this guy can't be from that era. And they said, don't worry, he wasn't doing anything in 1963 for the CIA. Well, it turns out that he'd been working for them since the 50s and that he created the Oswald Project. He was the guy giving the intelligence information out to the congressional committees investigating the CIA. So basically, it's, they were defending themselves from within using Joannides. Now, for this and other things which we'll never know, there are accommodations up and down for our friend Joannides, and those documents actually did come out today. And these are progress reports about his psychological warfare, political action, and how he was the deputy chief of branch handling all aspects of psychological warfare and supervising case officers. And they give him such high marks that you can see why they turned to him to rescue their program. Now, at the end of his life, something interesting happens, which is he is given the Career Achievement Medal. This isn't something the CIA gives out easily. The person who gives him that medal in 1981 is one Admiral Bobby Inman. Inman's very important, and this picture is the crux of why we need all the Joannides information from the Central Intelligence Agency. Inman here, not only has he been deputy director of the CIA, the NSA, and an admiral in the Navy, but he also will talk very loosely in the mid to late 80s about the UFO file. He will say on record, not only do we know about the UFO craft, we know who is piloting them. This is what he says on the record. And he shares these opinions with magazines and radio shows. He's part of a very early CIA disclosure operation. Inman is still alive, and he would go on to work for XE, which was a mercenary group that Blackwater turked into, and SAIC, which has a role in 9/11 and others. Now, it is my belief that if Congress had Inman under oath, that he could tell us a great deal about Joannides. If we had the CIA records on Joannides and Inman's information for why he actually got this medal, there you're looking at the UFO file with Bobby Inman on one hand, and on the other hand, George Joannides, the JFK assassination mastermind for creating the Oswald project. Those two together. Some of the things about Admiral Inman: former director ONI, former director NSA, former director NURO, former director SAIC, DIA, deputy director, former vice director CIA. This is the resume that you want for something as highly secret as the UFO file. This is a crucial aspect. I'm not saying that Inman is involved in the JFK assassination, but he's behind that wall of secrecy, and he knows what Joannides' activities were. President Kennedy was assassinated by this group inside the aerospace intelligence wing. There's a reason why the aerospace group was involved, and that involves the UFO file. There's a host of reasons that structure needed him removed. And so, there's a great many people who've brought things to light. But whenever I hear things, this kind of lightweight thing, well, the mafia wanted Kennedy dead or whatever, first of all, the Secret Service can thwart that, and that's why you don't have presidential assassinations. One, they're incredibly rare. And two, the mafia can't thwart, they can't alter autopsies, and they can't tell the media not to talk about stories. So the mafia are a tool of the intelligence agency. That's how the deep state tower works. I keep calling Professor Scott President Scott. Maybe he should be president. But Professor Peter Dale Scott showed me, and it's in our interviews, which we have many interviews with Professor Scott on this program, but how that deep state pyramid works. And organized crime operates on this lower level in the Central Intelligence Agency. Above that, then the contracting agencies around the Central Intelligence Agencies, and then the financial services and the financial groups that are involved, and the oil money and drug money and those types of things. And then the groups that manage that money. There's this kind of a snapshot of the deep state. The only thing that I would add is that, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and all these other people building this space infrastructure to control things from above gives us more of that snapshot. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special JFK report on the JFK records that came out today. We'll be taking some of your questions here very shortly, because we're going to make it just a short report tonight, and we have a very special interview with Whitney Webb tomorrow, and talking about her very intriguing book, and you don't want to miss that. At 8:00 tomorrow night. Okay. How are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Fantastic.
Do you want a question?
Sure.
Okay. So David Termina says, DJ, do you think that Dry-Hole Bird's Civil Air Patrol was actually an experimental MK Ultra camp?
Good point. Well, Ferry knew a great deal about hypnosis. As a matter of fact, this is a very interesting guy who went on the record saying that he was in Ferry's unit with Oswald, and that Ferry had actually done a number of things to hypnotize him, and that he would wake up in odd places like libraries or theaters. So it's very interesting to look at Oswald later showing up at this theater, waiting for his contact, or was he hypnotized to go there? There's a lot of mind control in the JFK assassination. Jack Ruby is completely mind controlled. And he is handled, by Jolly West, who we know when you go through those threads, you're going to find Jolly West involved with things like Charles Manson and all of the major cases that spin the culture the way the intelligence agencies and the deep state want it to go. But that aspect, that Manchurian candidate aspect, the control of the mind, certainly is an active factor. And absolutely. The idea about D.H. Byrd, too, he was the person, again, who owned the Texas School Book Depository. And he is the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who takes us to Antarctica. And when he gets to Antarctica, he's, basically all these saucers are all around him and he has to get out of there in Operation High Jump. That's significant for a number of reasons. But the other thing is that, his D.H. Byrd's other cousin is Senator Byrd. And Senator Byrd in Texas is in charge of all NASA appropriations. All the money that goes for space is through him. So we have a huge space corridor. And Byrd is someone who is heavily vested in experimental aerospace. So when Lee Harvey Oswald walks into his job there at the Texas School Book Depository, he's in a building that's owned by a major aerospace investor. And, so the idea of the regular idea of the story is so ridiculous. Take it like this. Okay, this guy is obsessed with communism and he goes to live in Russia and he brings back a Russian wife here. He has a lot of financial problems, but he gets a job through this millionaire who takes an interest in him and says, I can get you a job at the Texas School Book Depository, a millionaire geologist. And he says, okay, I'll do it. How much do I get? Oh, $1.25 an hour. Okay, you're all set. So he goes to work there. And guess what? 6 weeks after he gets to work there, the president goes by the window. This is the perfect opportunity for this anarchist communist to shoot the president. What a lucky break. So he brings a broken gun up to the window. It has a malfunctioning scope, and you have to reload it, and it's one of the worst weapons in history. But he gets off the most incredible shooting feat, and as it turns out, he, is able to assassinate the president. And it's all because he got this job in this Texas School Book Depository. And guess what? When he got the job, no one even knew that President Kennedy was going to Dallas in the public. So what a lucky break, huh? It's pretty interesting. If you go back, one of the things that's in those records today, and the story has been out there for a while, but there's more evidence around this, which is that just 3 weeks earlier in Chicago, President Kennedy had been in a motorcade, and they were going to have a full motorcade until they found out that there was somebody who was set up with a lot of weapons, and he was going to shoot at Kennedy with a high-powered rifle from an office building, very much like the Texas School Book Depository. The guy's name was Thomas Valley, and he has a lot of things in common with Oswald, including the fact that he was an ex-Marine, and he was erratic, and he even had kind of a little bit of a visual that was typical. Looks something like Oswald. He was sort of like an outlandish Oswald. So they had set up different patsies, or as Professor Scott calls them, designated culprits. I like designated culprits. And one of the things that Professor Scott noticed as a pattern around designated culprits, like the 9/11 hijackers, for example, is that the regular investigating agencies had been warned off by the Central Intelligence Agency before these people did the deed, so that things like the Secret Service wouldn't be looking for Oswald. As a matter of fact, the Secret Service, based on the CIA recommendation, took Oswald off of their watch list only 2 months before he assassinates, in quotes, President Kennedy. Well, isn't that an odd thing to do? Because otherwise the Secret Service would have been aware of it. They would have looked him up. They would have flashed his social security number. And guess what? They would have said, oh, he's on the motorcade route. We need to watch that and make sure there are no open windows at the Texas School Book Depository. None of that stuff happens. Now, there are going to be some really far out aspects that are set up to what we're going to further report on this. But I want to finish this track that we're on with Joannides and Inman briefly here. And then we're going to take some of your questions, and then we're going to move on, right?
Okay.
For the evening. Everyone, it's great to have so many of you here. It is very important that we talk about the records release with the JFK assassination and what the government is still hanging on to for dear life. But it's very crucial for the American people to know that President Kennedy's assassination was brought about as the result of the collaboration of the intelligence agencies with this aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex, because that wing has continued to grow and the intelligence agencies have continued to grow, and they've spread out through things like Homeland Security, which is now threatening that, if we say something they don't like, that we're domestic terrorists, and they can shut off our internet and things of this nature. Department of Homeland Security now has 250,000 employees. Think about that. This agency didn't exist until the 9/11 attacks. And if you go throughout Homeland Security, you're looking at CIA people. This is the nature of the problem. It keeps growing. And, it faced reform in the 1970s as a result of its involvement one way or another with the assassinations of the Kennedys and overthrowing governments and things of that nature. The only thing that happened to the CIA, there was never any reform, is that they offshored themselves during the Carter era when there was a cleanup attempt. And then as soon as Reagan got in, they all swept themselves back into power. And that's where you got, the crack cocaine epidemic and wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador and all of that. Central American coke drug running and all the rest of it. That's all Central Intelligence Agency action. The question is, at what point does the system buckle with the CIA in charge? So it's a very potent question, and it takes us right to the core of the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating their own president. This is a problem that America needs to resolve, and it can only resolve it with the records, not with this fluff stuff that they released while they keep the good stuff. So Joannides is a flashpoint in American history, and we can prove it through the various aspects that he set up and was responsible for a psychological warfare operation involving Lee Harvey Oswald the summer before the assassination. That's crucial. And also the general story is that, the CIA didn't know anything about Oswald. They not only were working with Oswald, they were very aware of him and set him up as the patsy for the assassination. This is the stuff that needs to come out. Okay, let's go a little bit further on this front. I need to, before I do that, this is Newsweek. This is interesting, and this was the weird two-step that was going on in relation to the release of these files. Now, 5 days before this release, this sounds like this is going to be a big release. And all these newspapers are flashing, all these websites saying, hey, Oswald connection to the CIA revealed through new documents. Okay. So let's read it. This is Newsweek, a week before this recent release. A core of researchers looking into the 1963 assassination of President Kennedy say they've unearthed proof his alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was involved in an operation by the CIA mere months before his killing, reigniting questions about whether the Oswald truly was alone. The Oswald? That's weird. Was truly alone in his decision to kill the youngest man ever elected president. In a Tuesday press conference at the National Press Club, Jefferson Morley, veteran of the D.C. Press Corps, expert on the JFK's assassination with the Mary Farrell Foundation, told reporters that he and attorneys with the foundation obtained documentation relating to a still classified covert operation approved by senior CIA officials 3 months before Kennedy's death that suggested the agency used Oswald for intelligence purposes several weeks prior to the shooting. Quote, "This is an extraordinary serious claim, and it has profound implications for the official story," Morley said Tuesday morning in Washington. The CIA knew far more about the lone gunman than they are admitting even today, so this story deserves the closest possible scrutiny. Quote, this is Newsweek. "The document, one of several researchers obtained this month as the result of an October lawsuit, is a precursor to a fuller release of documents anticipated by the National Archives this month." That's the junk that came out today. Now, trek with me very closely here. There's a lot of strange things going on. By the way, Newsweek magazine officially blocks Dark Journalist. Isn't that interesting? Well, I pointed out in their reporting that the person who was giving them information, the unnamed source, and these stories were all about this continuity of government program of training these generals to get ready in case Trump didn't leave office. This is in 2020. And I said, well, the only person who could be giving that information is Terence O'Shaughnessy, because they described it as a man, and the previous COG commander before him was a woman, and the one before her is dead. So it had to be O'Shaughnessy. It was just a process of deduction, because they said it was a former NORAD COG commander. Well, they flipped out. They called me names, and their writer, their very distinguished writer, William Arkin, who's written books and all this stuff, flamed out and let himself off the hook. I even forget what he called me, but he called me every name in the book. And then they blocked me. This magazine blocked me. Now, let's see if we can kind of figure out why. Let's read between the lines of this story for a minute. So they're saying in this kind of fake release, see, what happens is Jefferson Morley goes to the National Press Club and he says these things, and he's there with
it was Captain Kangaroo.
Captain Kangaroo. That was it. Interesting. Yeah. Very good intellectual barb there. But here's the interesting thing. So he stands up and says George Joannides was involved, and the Mary Farrell Foundation is involved in a lawsuit to get the Joannides records from the Central Intelligence Agency. They filed the lawsuit in October. They haven't got any documents. In January, they get an answer on their query in the lawsuit. So there hasn't been any records at all. So here's Newsweek. Ready? The document, one of several researchers obtained this month as the result of an October lawsuit, is a precursor to a fuller release of documents anticipated by the National Archives this month. There is no document. He didn't present any documents when he went to the National Press Club. Now, this is a weird thing that's going on here. Morley has the Joannides story, hardcore. And the Joannides story, I think, is a fantastic breakthrough on the JFK assassination front, because we've got the architect of the Oswald project, and the CIA won't give up his records. And he's directly tied with the Bobby Inman piece to the UFO file. But Morley didn't claim I have a document that shows all this stuff. But here's Newsweek, and they're signaling something. I don't know what's going on here, but here's some more weirdness. In a Tuesday press conference at the National Press Club, Jefferson Morley, a veteran of the D.C. Press Corps, expert on the JFK assassination, told reporters he and attorneys with the foundation obtained documentation relating to a still classified covert operation approved by senior CIA officials 3 months before Kennedy's death. Yeah, he has been on this track, and he has sued the CIA for those documents because he knows that they hold the documents, but he doesn't have the documents, and he didn't say that he did. And then here they say the document, one of several researchers obtained. So there is no document. So I don't know what this article is talking about, but for me, there's a lot of signaling in that. And so that they were saying, you know what, we'll create this phony story that, yeah, there's a JFK, on the record document story relating to Oswald and the CIA, and it's like this. And they flashed that story through worldwide press. BBC had it, New York Times, everybody. But unfortunately, there was nothing to it because there wasn't any new documentation, because that case doesn't even get looked at until January. So what was that all about before this actual records release comes out and they say, we don't have anything on Oswald for you? Something strange there. It's like pumping up a balloon and deflating it, which is that's what a CIA exercise usually does. But for the record, Jefferson Morley tripped into the George Joannides story through deep research, and he found out that the Central Intelligence Agency was holding 44 files relating to Joannides. They didn't want to give them up, and they did their best to even, if you look through the different people who ran the ARRB and things like that, to hide the existence of Joannides from all of them. So Joannides is a key linchpin, and they get very funny whenever we get around it. Even the idea that they were saying, hey, Newsweek is like, he's right. They have these files and they let them out, and now they're proving that the CIA was involved with Oswald, but on the record they don't have to give anything out. Do you see how strange that is? All right, let's go a little further with this. Morley puts out on his Substack talking about this, and he says, I got criticized because the national media pumped up all this stuff, and then when people looked at it, they said I didn't actually present anything new. And he says, I'm going to present evidence for this Oswald project done by the Central Intelligence Agency and someone who actually participated in it. And this will all come out within a month. This much he did put on the record. And so someone who was involved with this whole thing is going to go on the record, and we're going to know about it. So the phony two-step of, just saying that they said what they didn't and had documents and stuff, and then the deflating release from today with no Oswald records and, hey, here's a bunch of fluff about Oswald doing his laundry. That whole thing is in lieu of the fact that Morley, someone in there knew, in that media structure, knew that Morley had talked to someone in this. And they wanted to kind of get more information or something there. But what we get at the end of the day is, one, Morley doesn't have any new documents because the Biden administration and the CIA haven't given them to Mary Farrell, who's launching the lawsuit, and they don't hear back from them until January. One. Two, the weird articles that came out in Newsweek or whatever were fluff. And they reported things that weren't true, that they had all these, that Morley had all these documents and all the rest that he gained through the Mary Farrell Foundation lawsuit. None of that happened. That's weird. And today's release of documents so far is very, for people like Morley, myself, and others who have looked at it, it doesn't look like they have anything in there that reveals anything about the CIA, and that basically 93% of the core documents, Garrison, Joannides, and the CIA involvement in the setting up Oswald, none of that's in there. So, they've deflected mightily, and they've deflected this off to June. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at a very, very strange entry in the record. And, this is the home of the X series. So you're going to go get things on a very deep level here, and be prepared, because this one's going to take you into places you haven't been before when it comes to the JFK assassination. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the JFK Special Report. Let's see here. Well, we'll take about 10 minutes with this, then we'll take some of your questions, and we'll call it a night. How's that, Miss Olivia? How are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Fantastic.
Lots of fantastic questions.
Do you have something you want to run by me?
Sure. Mike A. JFK was tough on Ben-Gurion over the FARA exception for Israel and the lack of transparency over the Dimona nuclear plant shortly before 1963. Trump swore his allegiance to Israel in 2016. Could this play a part in the secrecy?
Yeah. Kennedy didn't want a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and he was adamant with Ben-Gurion and the Israeli government not to develop their own nukes. That much is for sure. And I've gone into this before, but basically the upshot is that they were no fans of President Kennedy. And, the tentacles around the globe that were trying to get rid of Kennedy do run deep. Interestingly enough, aerospace runs through that Israeli story as well. By the way, here's a shot of Inman with Caspar Weinberger, who was largely involved in the Iran-Contra scandal and President Bush pardoned. And those are the kind of high-flying people that Inman was involved with in his career. And I think his career holds up quite well as a major gatekeeper on a lot of this. And yet he had that era of transparency where he came out and was talking very openly about the UFO file. I think, one, he should come out and talk about these matters and talk about Joannides and what he knew about giving him the career CIA medal and what his involvement was. And I also think that if he was put under oath about Joannides, that we'd get some very interesting material about that. I'd prefer him just to talk about it and to volunteer all that. Okay. Now, the JFK assassination and the UFO file and some real unusual X information. Are you ready? Here we go. Now, in 1952, they were launching Project Blue Book. And they had something called the Robertson Panel. Interestingly enough, Sylvia Marr, who was a very early investigator of the JFK assassination and very keen, and what happened was, she was targeted by intelligence agencies, and it's a very tragic story, but her family, after 10 years of doing this research, had her committed, in fact. And she was a very, accomplished PhD working on this work. But she got out, but her life was emotionally damaged as a result, and she abandoned all of the Kennedy research. I always wondered about her work in relation to that because, whenever you get that close to the story, watch out. Here's an interesting thing that she says. She's writing a letter here, and this is in relation to Paris Flamand, who I've been spotlighting recently because I'm still looking to get his complete book series, The Assassination of America, which you can't find anywhere. And people have been very kind and generous sending me leads on this, Abe's books, eBay, and things like that. And I appreciate that. However, I have been through those different travails, and the Paris Flamand books are the hardest to find. That Assassination of America series. His Kennedy assassination book from the 60s is still around, but the series he wrote in 2007, and it's got the New Orleans figures and it's got these other things. You cannot find this book. If somebody has the series, I'll pay money for that series. And it's a 4-book series. Okay, I do have 2 of the books already, but the New Orleans book is really the main one I'm looking for. Okay, so Sylvia Marr is a JFK researcher, and she's writing to a friend about Paris Flamand, and she goes off about a number of different things. And she's talking about UFOs here on the bottom. And by the way, Flamand wrote a book about UFOs in the 70s. But she says, just the other night, I stumbled into an interesting coincidence. And by the way, this ties into a 3-hour episode that's coming up here on the X series. So this will be a lead into that, surely a preface, a taste of things to come. All right. Dr. Luis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate, 1968, was a CBS expert for the 1967 news inquiry into the JFK assassination and claims that he discovered the blurs in the frames of the Zapruder film, which he and CBS assert are corresponding with the 3 shots while overlooking the interval of 42 frames between the first 2 shots. So he was one of these guys who said, I'm an expert because I'm a Nobel laureate physicist, and I can tell you for sure that the Zapruder film, misses the accuracy and all the rest of it. And he was one of the guys who was responsible with Life magazine of putting the frames in the wrong order so that it looked like President Kennedy's head was going forward when they printed them. When people would see the Zapruder film, which didn't happen on television until 1975, they noticeably realized that President Kennedy's being shot from the front. So the whole thing about Oswald behind him gets blown away. The single shooter, the magic bullet, all that stuff gets blown away, and the entire story around Oswald. So we've been living in that twilight really since they showed the movie, the Zapruder film. Now, he was largely responsible for giving the government credibility on this, but he'd done it before. And Sylvia Marr found this out. And she said, it turns out that Alvarez was on the Robertson panel of 1953, which produced a very carefully phrased report utilized by the government to debunk the entire Air Force handling of the subject of UFOs and basically consign the UFOs to frauds and hoaxes. Now, that's really true. The Robertson panel was designed by the CIA to get everyone looking the other way. And that, basically all the sightings were about looking at the planet Venus and all that. Now, here are the people who were on the Robertson panel. Luis Alvarez, who she just referenced here, physicist, radar expert, and later Nobel Prize recipient. Frederick Durant, a CIA officer. Sam Gouchschmidt, Brookhaven National Laboratories, nuclear physicist. That's important because of the particle accelerators in the beginning of CERN. And J. Allen Hynek, astronomer and consultant to Blue Book. Hynek came out and said, Blue Book is a whitewash, and they made me say these things. I want the real truth. And then the 70s Close Encounter movies featured him and all the rest of it. And he was a major push for disclosure. Okay, Alvarez. Luis Alvarez, Dr. Alvarez. Let's start to get our heads wrapped around this person. So on one hand, Alvarez is involved in debunking the UFO file with the Robertson panel. What else is Alvarez involved in? Well, interestingly enough, he's involved, as he worked for the Warren Commission, and he was involved with basically debunking the buzz around the frontal shot, and he put out physics studies on the JFK assassination supporting the official story and giving us that whole cover for it. But what else was he involved in? All right. Alvarez, as it turns out, after doing his bit to debunk UFOs and the JFK Assassination Zapruder film, he shows up in a very unusual project, and the project is mapping the Sphinx to find the Hall of Records. Take a good look at Alvarez's work around the Sphinx. Well, what else? Let's look at this. Luis Alvarez, the search for hidden chambers in the pyramids. The structure of the second pyramid at Giza is determined by cosmic ray absorption. So he had the special process of using cosmic rays to find secret hidden chambers. Quote, 3 pyramids at Giza are situated a few miles southwest of Cairo, Egypt, with 2 larger pyramids standing within a few hundred meters of each other. They're originally almost exactly the same height. And he goes on to lay out this idea of why he's able to use these cosmic rays to see in to the Sphinx, to the Great Pyramid in this case. All right, physics paper, February 6, 1970, Luis Alvarez's paper in Science on Cosmic Ray and the Pyramids of Egypt. When archaeologists confirmed their discovery of a hidden burial chamber of an Egyptian pyramid in 2017, it was in some respects the culmination of a project undertaken in the 1960s. A physicist named Luis Walter Alvarez came up with the idea of using cosmic rays to map dense structures like the Great Pyramid of Giza. Alvarez was born in 1911 in San Francisco. His father and grandfather are both physicians. Aunt Mabel was an artist. The family relocated to Minnesota, and he went to University of Chicago, got a PhD, and then he starts to work for the Rad Lab. Well, it's interesting because the person in charge of the Rad Lab at that point is Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush is in charge also of the UFO file. Now, Vannevar Bush's protege at MIT, where Alvarez shows up, is John Trump, who is Trump's uncle. So there's a lot of distance to go here. How much of this I should save for the next episode?
Keep going.
Is interesting, but I will say this. Here's more quotes from the reports around Alvarez. His earlier cosmic ray research eventually led to his 1965 proposal that one could use muon tomography to hunt for previously undiscovered chambers in the Egyptian pyramids. Alvarez and an interdisciplinary team of physicists and archaeologists placed spark chambers in a known chamber beneath the second pyramid of Khafre to detect incoming cosmic rays and measure their deflections as they hit the solid rocks of the structure. The muons would pass right through the chamber, however, registering a void in the resulting image. Alvarez's natural curiosity often took him well outside the physics of the laboratory. When Life magazine published photographs in 1966 of President Kennedy's assassination, Alvarez applied his expertise in optics and photo analysis of the images. His conclusions, outlined in a tutorial paper, went against many of the conspiracy theories of the time. There's a lot more on this piece, but this is what I want to show you about how Exprotect works. This is their level of expertise. And when I say Exprotect is an unusual group, that the Central Intelligence Agency used an astral aspect, an astral agency, to cover up and confuse early episodes of the UFO file with the Men in Black stories and all the rest. This is the level that they work on. Now, I'll tell you, Exprotect involves voodoo. It involves astrology. It involves apparitions. It involves the hunt for the Hall of Records. In fact, a group of CIA agents were stationed at the ARE in 1964 on record to get information directly about the Hall of Records. The CIA has been engaged, involved with searching for Noah's Ark and the power of sacred object and the archaeology wars. There was a great piece that came forward when I was working with Dr. Farrell on this, and we went into great detail about the Baghdad Museum looting. There was no reason for the Americans to stand by and let that happen, but they did. And a number of things, sacred objects, were looted from that museum. That is the essence of archaeology wars and the Hot Zone series that we have on this program. That's the essence of what takes place. We have to understand then a group like Exprotect utilizes all that. Why do you think remote viewing sits in the middle of intelligence groups and all that information that we got in relation to them? They're using things beyond what we would normally consider. So therefore, when we get into psychological operations, we have those who show up like Joannides, and they're connected directly to the UFO file. And, people like Inman are right in that corridor and certainly interface with these people. The question is that agency, how do we get a handle on Exprotect? That is the question. And what I'm putting forward is that someone like Alvarez is a perfect type of pattern for what they would use. For example, he shows up, one, and uses his expertise to create the Robertson panel and become the leading debunker of UFOs. Two, he uses his expertise again to support the government's position when the intelligence community assassinates its own president. Three, he's deeply involved in the esoteric endeavor of finding the Hall of Records. He's mapping out the pyramid with cosmic rays. Add those things up, and you're getting a look at what the Exprotect group is all about. Those are the types of levels and areas that we go to when we're looking for this. And when we get into the Kennedy assassination, these groups are involved, which is why you get all the strangeness around the Nine and people of this nature involved in it. Everywhere you look around the JFK assassination, there are aerospace aspects. And if you look at the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, you will find everywhere you look around Oswald, aerospace signature in the UFO file. It's undeniable, and it's been put on the record. The question is, what is that interface, and what is it, the nature of the thing that they're protecting? That's the apothegm. That's the piece that we're putting together. That's why the Kennedy assassination touches on so many different areas, because, Kennedy's taking the country towards freedom. He's liberating us from nuclear warfare by saving the world from a gigantic nuclear conflagration over Cuba in 1962, where someone else like Nixon would have clearly gone into Cuba. Kennedy quarantined it and worked out the time, gave the Russians the time to back off. It's a very important thing that we don't see practiced. He had a peace process and a diplomacy process. There's no peace process involved in Ukraine, for example, because people like Biden and his family are taking tremendous benefit from that war. And Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all these people are getting paid off dramatically, through missile programs and all the rest of it, while we get ourselves involved in potentially a nuclear incident and possibly World War III. This is how this group thinks. It's a sick cohabitant with the public state. And, this is something I think we need to get our heads wrapped around. So when President Kennedy is attempting to smash that Central Intelligence Agency using National Security Action Memorandum 57, which says only the Joint Chiefs can do this stuff, no more paramilitary from the CIA, then he's regarded as a national security threat. But the Douglas Caddy admission that E. Howard Hunt had put on the record, and by the way, a big star of today's records was E. Howard Hunt, because they wouldn't let his records out. That's pretty significant. Well, what did Hunt say? Here's a CIA agent on the record. Hunt said LBJ worked with CIA agents to assassinate President Kennedy. That's what he said at the end of his life. They had killed his wife, and they had, worked him into the Nixon White House to create Watergate. But once he got caught, he was a liability. And his wife dies under very bizarre circumstances. And I've talked to St. John Hunt. I'm going to have to get him on the program to talk about his mom, and very interesting stories about his dad. But I talked to him about Douglas Caddy, and I've talked with Doug. I've worked with him on a number of things, and he's always given us incredible background. And one of the things that St. John Hunt said about Caddy was, oh yeah, he was around, when I was growing up. I mean, he was a friend of the family. He was a close friend of my dad's. Caddy, the Watergate lawyer, put on the record, and there's that scene in All the President's Men where these two guys, Woodward and Bernstein, bump into him representing the Watergate burglars. Caddy puts on the record that Hunt told him Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to share a most vital national security secret with the Soviets. Caddy asks Hunt what it was, and Hunt says the UFO file. It's the alien presence. That piece is crucial for us. That's great. It's just everything went foggy there. I like it. Okay. Interesting. Let's see if we get that back. But I think this is the kind of thing that we need to sort of put us back on track with this. And little screen. There we go. Well, that's a little too much fun, isn't it? All right. There we go. Perfect. Perfection in a nutshell. So to recap this now, Caddy, the Watergate lawyer, put on the record that E. Howard Hunt said JFK was assassinated over the UFO file. When we think about this, it is the most important piece that we have on the historical record in terms of someone saying to this other person in private, this is what happened, and the position that Hunt had. Now, you can take it or leave it in terms of whether or not what he said was accurate, but it's a stunning admission, and the level that we're getting it from isn't, someone's, I mean, the level, if you think about Caddy, the level he was on and the people he was interfacing with, and the fact that he's the Watergate lawyer, I mean, that puts things on a different level. So the great failure of the UFO file community, they didn't acknowledge this piece. This is crucial as we get these records out. If you can't track the piece that they're saying, we're going to keep the Hunt records, we're going to keep the Joannides records, we're going to keep the Garrison records, those are the records that are going to reveal what the problem was. And those are the records that reveal Exprotect in the final analysis. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, Simone Nyman. Does DJ think Prince William saw the forbidden records on his recent visit to the JFK library? What was that visit all about?
Yeah, this is important because Biden spent a lot of time here. He was in Nantucket, but he went to the Kennedy Library twice, which is unusual. And when Prince William and Kate were here, that whole thing, I think, was an excuse for him to get there. And I think there was some possibility that they think something is going to come out in relation to the Mary Farrell lawsuit. And maybe they'd heard this thing. Morley hadn't let out that he was basically, putting it on the record that he had this piece, that he's got somebody who's a witness who's going to put this on the record. This is a story that's floating under the radar for some reason. He can't come out with it yet, but somebody in that structure is aware. So now, when Morley and Judge Tunheim, he was the guy, he's a Minnesota judge, federal judge, who oversaw the Assassination Record Review Board. He's the one who looked at a number of records and said, these are the ones that are classified and these are the ones that can go public. So he's seen a lot and he knows very well, which is why he's sitting there with Morley, that the Oswald project was created by Joannides. He's looked at this. So they're sitting there. Now he can't, because he, is under rules from the Assassination Record Review Board. He can't say, I saw this record and he's guilty. But he can say, I support this guy, which is what he's doing by being there. So I think that stuff is very significant. The problem is with the whole Farrell Foundation and Morley approach is that their whole thing is the CIA is covering up that they were involved in this Oswald psychological operation thing. They're not saying the CIA was involved in murdering President Kennedy. They won't go there with it. That's a problem, because the Central Intelligence Agency created the Oswald Project in order to kill President Kennedy and then get away with it and set up Oswald as the patsy. He's the CIA patsy, as I said in my documentary. So that's where I think that line needs to go in order to get the public to understand what they're trying to do. On the other side, on the UFO file side, they don't, a lot of the UFO researchers don't have the equipment to deal with the deep state research. And so deep state researchers understand how the government operates, and, they wouldn't sit there with CIA agents talking about UFO disclosure, so we have problems in that field. So the UFO field needs to step up to a level, and the deep state researchers who deal with things like government assassination need to allow for the fact that a lot of these things are motivated by an entirely secret structure that's dealing with an exotic technology in the aerospace, a secret corridor between the defense contractors and intelligence. This is the piece that's missing. And that's why when we get record releases, if you don't have that understanding going in, then them rolling out stuff and blocking Joannides records and saying, well, that's classified. I mean, that's no release at all. Yes.
Wendy Eder. So could the alien presence revelation be the reason Trump felt he could not release all the JFK documents?
I think the UFO file could have been involved with what he was looking at. That's what there's only a few things that somebody could absolutely not release records over. And it's not that the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. They're hiding that. But basically, in all those polls after polls, Americans believe that the CIA killed President Kennedy. And there's a reason for that, because researchers have brought that forward, actual researchers who are called conspiracy theorists. And then, like in the traditional dark journalism rules, there's junk conspiracy under that. Yes. Like, oh, the driver shot him and all this kind of stuff.
Or Jackie.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
So those are supposed to be catchy stories to, throw off regular people who are looking into this. And they get involved with that and they say, I don't want to do it. The thing about the UFO file being behind the president's assassination, what's interesting is how much supportive evidence that there is. And there's a lot. I couldn't have done the shows that I've done in relation to this. I did an entire documentary called UFO File Assassins Exprotect. That whole piece is about aerospace assassins in relation directly to the UFO file. And these people are all deeply involved with it. So, Oswald, when he comes back from the Soviet Union, he stays with Michael Paine. Michael Paine is the protege of Walter Dornberger, who's the Nazi rocket scientist, who was in charge of von Braun and saved from the judgment at Nuremberg, because von Braun said, I need him to make this work. And so he was saved because of crimes against humanity by using slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. It's undeniable. If you go just an inch deep, it's undeniable. And so the fluff on top about, angry Cubans and mafia people or whatever, that's really scenery. The deeper core is Kennedy represents a threat to the establishment, and he's changing the world order. And for them, they want to build, what's their goal? The goal of this organization, Exprotect, with the deep state, the Central Intelligence Agency, is to build a space infrastructure to control things on the ground. That's what they've been after from the beginning. So if Kennedy is about, I'm going to bring the Russians up to the moon with us, and there's no weapons in space, by the way. And by the way, we're going to share the UFO file with them, and eventually, we're going to share that with the public too. That's a threat to everything that they're doing, because the top national security secret in the United States is the UFO file. So this is the impasse that we're at. It's why we're in a culture of a kind of schizophrenic values. It's because the top is operating on this level and doing their own thing. I mean, we see so many mind games in relation to the financial aspect, the FTX scandal and, the deep state operating in these different areas, very often in the hot zone, and incredibly accruing wealth and defrauding investors, and then letting these people off with a, in this case, actually, Bankman-Fried was arrested recently. We'll see how far this gets. But I think in general, there's a lot of financial malfeasance that we see over and over again. If we could go one level deeper underneath that, then we would see that there's a structure that's operating and needs those slush funds. So it targets different areas. It targets pharmaceuticals. It targets cryptocurrencies. When we get into this, we start to move in a real way and say, there's a reason why they're trying to bring about this order the way that they're doing it. That's kind of transhumanist piece, but they need it. They need these different levels of funding to do it. And some of those corridors of funding have got to be publicly found out, like the FTX thing. So like Enron, we've seen this movie before, BCCI and others. It's a repeat pattern. And Professor Scott described it to me, and he said, well, this structure, this system of the deep state, what it does through a deep event like the Kennedy assassination or Watergate or Iran-Contra, the financial coup d'etat of 2008, the COVID op, 9/11, whatever it is, it steps in and it creates a deep event, and that changes all this policy. What do we get after 9/11? We're under emergency rules, right? You're under emergency powers. Since when? It's America. The continuity of government people are all elevated. They're ready to take over. And, the COG structure, who really knows that much about it? I've studied it. Professor Scott studied it. William Arkin, the guy who got me banned from Newsweek, studied it. I must have said something wrong. This is very interesting to me because there's something about COG which is untouchable. But, when I've gone into looking at the space aspect and the space secrecy, the secret space program and things of this nature, I found that same secrecy level applies. That's why you get 50 years of no return to the moon, but there's no official comment about that. Well, they wanted to send up shuttles instead. No, you have a moon program you've invested in and created a whole NASA over, and then you don't go back for 50 years. There's a reason, and we're not told what that reason is. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. And it's great to have so many of you here with us. There was a huge JFK, a tranche of records released, but unfortunately, they held back the crucial CIA documents dealing with George Joannides, the Garrison file, and so many others relating to the creation of the Oswald project and the Central Intelligence role, things that would lead back to that Central Intelligence role in the assassination of President Kennedy, who died a hero, in my opinion, on November 22nd, 1963, fighting this deep state creature, which had developed all of this unlawful powers and abilities, and was basically, running around the world, overthrowing countries and installing drug cartels and doing all sorts of illegal activities and violating the rule of law in the name of the American government, but without the sanction of the American people. And he took that structure on and wanted to smash that structure into 1,000 pieces. And they, responded in kind, especially when he went after the UFO file. That was the final straw for Kennedy. But I think that they had looked at a number of options for his removal. And I think that there's a tremendous bravery. And Mikhail Gorbachev actually cited this when he gave his speech at the Texas School Book Depository, which I still find quite amazing that he did this, because the Texas School Book Depository, after all, is where the alleged assassin is supposed to have shot from. And here's Gorbachev giving this incredible short speech. But what he says is that the speech that Kennedy gave at American University in June of 1963 had not been given by any American president. And in that speech, Kennedy says, you know, we cannot afford to have a nuclear war where even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouths. You know, they had been used to the rah-rah speeches of, you know, we'll fight any enemy and that kind of thing. And here's Kennedy saying, you know, we have to reconsider our attitudes towards the Russians. And in the final analysis, you know, we all breathe the same air, we all live on this small planet, and we all cherish our children's future. You know, these are things which ripple across that power structure. And he's saying all people on earth are equal, and that's anathema to the Exprotect bunch. And that's why we need to smash the secrecy, and that's what we're doing here. And the way we can get at it is this intrigue around Joannides. I think that in particular could make a lot of tumblers fall. All right, Ms.
All right,
Olivia.
these are all connected, so I'm going to read them all. Danny C. says, Operation Paperclip is who we are fighting. David Tormina says, did JFK ever hint at getting rid of the Nazi presence inside the American deep state? Briggs 41 says, JFK was killed for learning about what happened at Area 51. It's not UFO. It's a national shame. He was about to go public and why he was threatening the CIA. Annie Jacobson covers this in detail.
No. First of all, Annie Jacobson.
Okay, but there's a lot about her. So
hold on. Here's the thing about Annie Jacobson. Okay. Annie Jacobson said Roswell was caused because the Soviet Union hired Dr. Mengele to alter infants, you know, or young children, and gave them unusually large heads and then shoved them in a flying saucer and crashed them in Roswell. Okay. Annie Jacobson is a mouthpiece for the organization. Okay. Make no mistake about it. That's why she's on CBS News. That's why she, you know, she's the, you know, it's the granted voice. It's what they want to hear on this. And so she'll do, I did an expose on Area 51, you know, and it's all of these stories to minimize what's actually going on and attribute it to something else. So it's there, it's information that's there to throw the public off, to throw the research community off, and it's sponsored from the inside. So that's where you have to take the Annie Jacobson thinking. So the first thing that you do is, you know, you look at who is motivating the information, where it's coming from, and what the nature of it is. And so, you know, inside the work of, say, Dr. Joseph Farrell, you're going to find a great deal about paperclip, and you're going to find a great deal about alternative exotic technology. And the motivation behind it is he wants to know, and he has the intelligence to find out what's going on there. The Annie Jacobson stuff, in my opinion, you know, if you have the book handy, toss it in the nearest trash.
Right. She's a limited hangout.
She is, well, yeah. And I think even worse than that, I think she's a scheduled, you know, she's a scheduled hangout. And no, Jacobson's work is not, it's not what we're talking about. This is what I mean about potency. And I'm going to describe potency. This is a real key concept for us going into 2023. There's a lot of programs out there. I've mentioned podcasts, and, you know, they're trying to tap into, this is what the Central Intelligence Agency did. In fact, they're trying to tap into the interests that we have in different subjects. So the top search in 2017 on Google was for UFOs. And so they figured this is a time for us to really buzz into this, you know, and we'll create our own. This is a time, this is the doorway for us to run the UFO threat operation, which we're still in the middle of, but they've now changed it around. And so we have the Fauci promoting Gary Nolan guy, that physicist over there, and he's the main go-to for UFOs now. And Elizondo, who really, you know, stumbled in public and went after people and stuff, and he embarrassed, I think, the agency. He had to back off. So, but we're in the middle of that whole thing, largely because they've gauged the public interest on it. So when we get around subjects that are from, like, around Atlantis, UFOs, these assassinations, deep state, and things of that nature, the researchers from the ground up are always going to give you the better, more quality information. That is, those that aren't influenced by the intelligence community, one, and those that aren't completely in service to a marketing agenda. There's nothing wrong with marketing, but we've seen the exploitation. Just think of what we went through with the secret space program, and the the horrible Wilcock good and all that junk, right? But there's another level of junk which comes in on a higher marketing level, and I include stuff like Jacobson in there. So what we need in terms of potency, when somebody like Tucker Carlson sits there and talks to Gary Nolan, or he sits there and talks to Lou Elizondo, those are Central Intelligence people. So the first thing that should be clear is, Nolan, have you worked for a decade with the Central Intelligence Agency? Okay. So now I can filter what you're saying a little bit easier, because these are kind of CIA talking points, but you can go ahead and say them, but I understand them as CIA talking points. Instead, it's, I'm a Stanford physicist, I love humanity, and we need to find out about UFOs. And guess what? I'm a CIA agent, who was abducted, right? This is the new thing that they're doing. So we have to kind of operate on a keener level and be less subject to that kind of junk conspiracy. And the potency helps us, because low potency is this limited hangout thing, and that is, like a Rogan podcast or Tucker Carlson or something like this. They're not, when they sit down with these people, the Central Intelligence Agency part has to be front and center. And that's going to help us right off the bat, because then okay, if I'm dealing with the UFO thing, I'm not dealing with disinformation right off the bat. Ryan Graves was an interesting example of this. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about Ryan Graves. This is just a fact. Ryan Graves was one of the Navy pilots that the TTSA used in order to promote the Tic Tac video. Now, it's my impression from reading those stories and watching his testimony and everything else that the government were using him in test exercises for exotic technology. They wanted to see how he would respond. For him, he's watching a UFO and he's responding to it. So that's all fine and well. Well, then Leslie Kean discovers him. Leslie Kean discovered Elizondo, after all, and created that whole phony story about him being a whistleblower and ex-Pentagon official, but he wasn't ex. So he was still working for the Pentagon. So remove the X part. That's part of the story, right? And he also wasn't a whistleblower. So what he was somebody who was dancing a counterintelligence line and putting this story out there to get a UFO threat piece going. Now, when we look at somebody who is out there, promoting these things, then what you have to do right away, like in the case of Graves, is say, well, what is the motivation really? So he wants to tell his story. That's great. Well, then the next thing is we find out that he's turned into now a defense contractor. That is, he created his own company that could be hired for his UAP expertise to, they would say, well, he has UAP expertise. Let's use his defense contractor company. So the question is, if somebody has a motivation to go before Congress and create a UFO office so they will get military contracts as a defense contractor, that puts it on a very different level than I'm a pilot and I saw something out a window and I'm giving my story, And so we had, there were a lot of shows where we just had people that would do that. You go back 20 years and you'd have like Larry King's show or something. Someone would come on and tell, I was a pilot, a commercial pilot, and I saw this UFO out my window and all the rest. This other stuff, Ryan Graves, is a little bit different because he's a defense contractor. So he has a direct benefit in the public believing enough in the UFO file and then being afraid of it, and then having Congress set up a commission to award all this money to a UFO defense office for which he gets the contracts. Now, if he's just a guy who had these experiences and wants to write a book about it, then there's no problem. But this other thing is a problem. So there has to be a way to inform the public about the motivations behind what's happening when we get into these things, because, on a high level and on a low level, whether it's Gaia TV or whether it's, TTSA and the History Channel, knowing where this stuff is coming from is very important. And you can also take it, on the UFO side, and you can just say, well, I'm in this for entertainment or something, along that line. That's different. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actually presenting the story as it is, and as it's true, and who is doing that. So when you get into people who are influenced, like Jacobson and others who are influenced by the intelligence community to put out certain types of narratives, that's different. Yes.
Mark Miller, DJ, what are your thoughts on David Adair and his claims and credentials?
Well, I don't get that much into it. But I don't have any quarrel with people who are interested in his work. It just doesn't appeal to me.
Yes. Okay. Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, where does the Nixon letter hiding in plain sight come in? And Jason May, was John G. Trump involved with the UFO file / JFK assassination suppression?
Well, I think that John Trump was involved in some very interesting projects. So he was involved with radiation. He was involved with radiation and communications in space. And he was involved as the protege of Vannevar Bush in the Rad Lab. And he was suggested upon Tesla's death of being the person to go through Tesla's personal effects to find information about this death ray and for this machine that could take down objects at a great distance. So, when he went in and reviewed all the Tesla work, he had to give a kind of a standard form letter saying, I didn't find anything of war value to it, whatever. But what he actually found, and the groups that had that information, you can only imagine. But then we have that, and then we also have the fact that his protege, Vannevar Bush, is the person in charge of the UFO file. So when President Trump was citing his uncle over and over again, I think it's significant. And the fact that Trump creates the Space Force, which is a major push for the UFO file piece to be back under executive control and not intelligence control. And then he declares in the middle of this, space as a warfighting domain. Those are major moves because they're incredible departures. The whole reason that we set up space, with the protocols that we did going to the moon and Kennedy's program, was to make space not a war zone. So that's where the space program was coming from. As a matter of fact, Eisenhower fought to have NASA not under military control, even though, in the final analysis, they're part of our national defense machine. He didn't want them under direct military control. So, these things have to be weighed out. What do you want in space? I mean, as a culture, what would you like? Do you want us shooting at each other in space? Or is the idea of space exploration and joint exploration of space a way to make all cultures aware of the fact that war, is problematic for humanity and could be an extinction event with the types of weapons that we possess? So the space program is very important in that engagement. So I think when we look at President Kennedy, he says we're going to go to the moon in this decade. And that's an incredible push on one hand, but he's also saying in these remarkable UN speeches about space, we're going into space because it's exploration and it's science and we're going to learn. And, it's a whole different sea to travel on our boats with. And the way that he puts it is, we have to make sure that that space is a war-free, weapons-free zone. And, we're moving toward, under the national security state with the NDAA and the problems that we have in relation to this, all their satellites are set up for communications or war. And, they're placing more and more weaponry in space. And the defense contractors are making huge plans for this. And they get to consolidate humanity on the ground here while they're making billions of dollars promoting weapons in space. That's a process that we need to wake up and take space back and say, no, no weapons up in space. So this is a thing that, humanity in every corner, not just America, has to step forward and say, space program was founded on peace principles. Let's move in that direction. And this group that's been trying to militarize space and control everything on the ground from space. Remember, that's a Nazi space plan from 1941. They want to control, and God knows the rocket experiments going back all the way into the 1920s, how long this thinking has been in there. But, they want to be up there in the firmament and controlling things on the ground this way. So that's something that needs to be prevented. And it often gets missed in the, in the midst of all of what we're going through, with them trying to turn everyone into a transhumanist robot. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Fantastic being with all of you here tonight and reviewing, looking at the incredible legacy of President Kennedy. It's been great taking your questions. And Miss Olivia, if you have a last final question.
I am going to ask the last question. I'm going to challenge you to really lay it out here. So can you lay out kind of a decade by decade picture, history timeline of the UFO, the modern UFO file, and relate it to the JFK assassination and where we are nowadays? So,
yeah, well, what you have to do to understand the UFO file really is to look at the different attempts towards some level of disclosure of this X technology. If you're involved and understand the X series, the X steganography series, the work that we've done here on this program, then you know that a lot of this technology goes back to the 19th century. But if you look into it, that's a renaissance of a much older technology that mystery schools have kept. This technology is spoken about in ancient texts, let's face it. Atlantis and the whole question around Atlantis, the Casey readings, the Steiner work, Blavatsky gives us a picture of what was going on back there. With that picture, we can get a much better sense that we've risen as a culture to high technical achievement and then been brought down in devastating destruction. Casey's story of our ancient past is the Atlanteans had incredible abilities, that they had flying ships that could go through mountains, never mind over mountains, they go through them. What kind of technology is that? There's that fascinating and tantalizing piece where they ask him, well, can you give us some description of what these Atlantean ships and aircraft were like? And he said, oh yeah, it's like what Ezekiel described, but that was a much later date. Somebody kept the technology so that it survived from Atlantis to Ezekiel's time. And so we're looking there at groups that had this technology a long time ago, and there are threads that are kept so that by the time we get this renaissance in the airship mysteries, and we go into this phase and we get the fable of the Wright brothers discovering air flight and stuff, the opening is the Cosmos Club, which is something that we did a couple of shows on in 2021. And the Cosmos Club founded in Cape Girardeau in 1866. This is someone who set up the Cosmos Club, and he was stationed there in Cape Girardeau. In 1941, Cape Girardeau would become the center of the first major UFO crash with bodies and all that kind of thing, and the descriptions from preachers going there because everyone thought it was a plane crash. So something about Cape Girardeau and the Cosmos Club, but then if you look at the Cosmos Club as we go on later in years, we're starting to see there that it's kind of a UFO Bilderberg because everybody involved in the UFO file is there. And strangely enough, President Kennedy was nominated by his brother, Robert Kennedy, to be in the Cosmos Club. He gets in and then he resigns within like 6 months. So again, there are all kinds of warning signs around the UFO file with Kennedy. But I think by the time you get into the early era around the UFO wave, the Kenneth Arnold wave, the post-Nazi development wave, something is interfacing there's a higher technology that's interfacing. So, there's a number of different categories you could place that in. But basically, the X technology that was developed in the mystery schools, and that maybe Tesla and John Trump and some of those people had a piece in, that resides in the UFO file side by side with the crashed technology retrieval piece. So that's all in there. And the thing that they have in common is that they alter dimensional physics to a point where universal rules of physics don't apply. That's why things go through. When people are getting abducted, they go through walls. And when UFO craft land, nothing ever grows there again. These types of things, it upsets the physical balance. So that effect, which I term apotheum, which has, antecedents as a word, but basically, you could say it's a word that I made up, apotheum. That effect comes directly out of these technologies. Those are the X technologies. And there's a huge battle over how to keep them, how to profit from them, how to present them, how to utilize them, how to keep them secret. And the wall of secrecy around them has caused our society to be upside down for decades. So that by the time you get to the Kennedy, just take it from the Caddy piece when he says Hunt told him that JFK was assassinated over the UFO file. It makes sense. And we know that he requested to share all the high threat UFO cases with the Russians so there wouldn't be a nuclear incident based on a UFO flying over a nuclear site, which had happened. So, when you get to that level, you start to understand the UFO file totally, on a much deeper level. And what happens is you look around the JFK assassination and you start to see people like Crisman and others who were associated with the first major UFO case, Maury Island. So, these things, there's a reason why there are all these aerospace and X technology and UFO aspects around these people. It's no accident. It's because they're interfacing with that, but there's no media outlet that can talk intelligently about UFOs and connect it with the Kennedy assassination. It takes that deep level of research. That's what we've endeavored to do here. And you can find that deep level of research. I've seen extraordinary research, Dr. Farrell's research, Gigi Young. We have the people and the talent to be able to do this. And then to understand that deeper political structure, we've had, incredible people like Professor Scott to understand what's going on in relation to a deep state structure that can operate and step into the public world. It's a covert structure, and it steps in and takes over the overt structure. And so the covert structure starts to run everything. And that structure is connected to the continuity of government program. And continuity of government program and the UFO file, what do they have in common? Those are the two most secret programs in the United States government. So unless we crack that, you can't really get far. So when we see things that float out about JFK files, came out and, Oswald was influenced by a Cuban or something. I mean, that's useless. What is useful is that Joannides is connected to the UFO file and psychological warfare operations. That gets us, that you're getting close. And that's the kind of information that we need. And we're going to be looking forward to bringing more of that to you in 2023. It's so great to have all of you here with us.
I don't know if you answered this question because I had to be watching the chat, but so our, I'll just put it out there. So, okay, we know we have underground cities, tunnels.
I want to live underground.
Did you address this? Is that where we have Roswell. We have Area 51. So is the tech all underground? Who is down there?
Well, I pointed this one out. This is
and what about Antarctica?
Well, who? Well, I think that we're going to save those for another episode, especially Antarctica.
You can just hit it.
What I'm going to do with this is I've shown this one, and it is the 7 days in May, which is President Kennedy helped get this movie going. He supported it, and he went away to Camp David and let them use the White House to shoot it. That is Burt Lancaster. He's playing a general on a desert base who is invoking continuity of government protocols to take over from a weak president. And right above him on the map, as you can see, if you look here, is Roswell. That is clear steganography delivered from a Hollywood movie in 1963 to your doorstep. And President Kennedy really was behind getting this movie out. So this is what he was up against in dealing with it. And these people have taken tremendous control in a non-democratic fashion. And it is preserving basically all of these protocols and information for a very small group that are in control. And those are the ones that we're dealing with, who are blocking things and controlling the media, and who think a conversation like this, I think when they look at the people in the ideas room, they shudder because they're shocked that people are on this level of knowledge. And I would think that the thing that they're trying to shut down, just like with the lockdowns and when they didn't want people within 6 feet of each other and all that nonsense, is they're trying to shut down that resonance of group intelligence, because in their own investigations, they realize, aha, that's how we've been overthrown. French Revolution happened, American Revolution. This is how this goes down, is these people resonate with each other and then we go down. So we're not going to let them resonate with each other. So, but in terms of underground, that's very important. And we've done some shows on the underground basis, but here's what I'll say about them. Originally, there was a vast infrastructure. Remember, Eisenhower created the highway system. While they were doing that, they created a vast underground system to survive a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. That structure became a secret structure that had no oversight, and nobody knew anything really about it. And even in 1987, when the continuity of government program gets brought up by Oliver North in his defense, when he's saying, look, I shredded these documents and did Iran-Contra because I was working with continuity of government office, they stand up and say, shut up. You can't talk about that in public session. Be quiet. So that's how continuity of government functioned and operated. And they've got underground bunkers ready for themselves. They have an entire underground infrastructure. And that's where a lot of those missing trillions disappear to. There's no question about it. So this is another factor that needs to be reconciled in the public. And, I hate to say it, but, forget about Twitter files and that stuff. It's very lightweight stuff, really is.
Compared to this.
Well, think about it. Musk, when they had him up there and, they found out that one of the people in Twitter was formerly an FBI person and he was doing all this operations. And then later they came to Musk and said in a tweet, are there any FBI people still working at Twitter? And he said, oh, the FBI is a fine organization. I support them, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this guy talks out of every side of his mouth, and I don't have any faith in that. I do see that the establishment has acknowledged that locking down people's free speech and, behaving in this undemocratic fashion has led them to lose a lot of public trust, and they're working on programs to regain it. But, I don't have any interest in Musk's transhumanism or things of that nature. He's one of those guys that are out there, and they've appointed him as a kind of Howard Hughes type character. So remember, it's not even really things that Musk is saying. Musk represents an interest of billions and billions of dollars. So, that's a multiple personality disorder. But, he's no worse than the rest of them. But, I think the kind of hero worship thing we have going on is a huge problem. And, it's one thing, like there's the left being suckers, but when the right are suckered too, that's kind of rough because, I think their whole thing is about being iconoclast and stuff. And, so this is the nature of extremes and how the society gets pulled in natures of extremes. Right now, you're looking at all this intense, hostile, liberal, left fanatical behavior on the woke side. And I agree that stopping that is crucial, because if you don't stop that, then the society just becomes mutated. And, the whole thing about confusing gender roles and all the rest of it, that just has to be booted out, because other countries who don't take on that nonsense are going to ascend. And, this is a program, and we have to understand a lot of that program resonates or has a center point in the World Economic Forum, and the policies that are coming out. But that's a worldwide global dictatorship they're trying to build, and it's a biometric dictatorship that they're trying to build and mutate humanity into, and we're just not going for it. So let's get on the program of pushing that back. And I think the revelation of the Kennedy assassination, it fits into this. It's one tapestry, it's an arc of human history. But Kennedy is all about freedom, and he's leading us in that direction. And the group that assassinates him, continue to cover up 60 years later what they did. And we're supposed to accept that, so that's not, a democratic republic. I don't know what you call it, COG occupied. That's what it feels like, for sure. But we're getting through it. And if we elevate the voices and support, as Catherine Fitz says, support our army on the ground. Who are the people who are doing great work? Well, the RFK Children's Health Defense. I think people like Rand Paul calling out Fauci, like, these are the people that we need to get behind. And I don't think this happens from the top down. I think it's a bottom up movement, no question about it. And with that, Miss Olivia, how are you doing on the super
Great.
chats?
I have a lot of super. Oh, we just got another one. Jim Sarge 3ID, Bob Bennett, Gil and Joy R, Erica Swenson Elliott, Ghost Malone, number 6, Robert Mearns, Joker 23, Into the Quantum, Dumbledore's Army, Undead Damon, Jordan Banner, Bobo the Clown, Robert Scott, this one's going to be good, Chiron Diumdrum, Brandon Kramer, Eurythmia's Fun, Calvin Center, Pinhas Lavon, Joseph Kinlaw, The Secret Spaceship, Roper Overbearing, Mike A, John Lavalette, Jane McMurphy 321, Wait a Minute 72, Undestroyer, Doyle Wayne, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Briggs 41, and Sean Jock. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. We really appreciate your support. It makes all the difference and helps us to deliver all year long these kind of deep investigations for you. And to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you so much. We will be back with you tomorrow night, the very special interview with Whitney Webb. And I'm looking forward to your reaction to that. We'll go very, very deep on the subjects. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here while I have you. Where did you get CERN? Oh, that's a long story. Where did I get CERN tarot cards?
eBay.
Think about this.
When they were available.
There was a whole thing that we did where I did a number of shows with Gigi Young on the CERN tarot deck. And I think we made a run on the cards or something because they became very hard to get. But we got them in time. Fantastic. Let's see. We got Philip Blair. Oh, I'm going to go all the way down here. Josh, Jen. Hey, it's great to see you out there. Thank you. Great show. Really appreciate that, Jen. Mr. Wonderful. Hey, wait, that's my name. Hold on. What's going on here? Incredible work, DJ and Olivia. Isn't that nice? Olivia, bravo.
Thank
Round
you.
of applause for you.
You're on fire tonight.
Well, there's so much to get to. And, Stepford Biden's release, so little time. Gigi, that's pretty wild cards. So Gigi's got a lot to say about those cards. Gigi, maybe we'll do like a part 3 on the CERN cards because we know a lot more on that now. I'm looking forward to that. And of course, everyone should check out Gigi Young's Mars Mysteries show. You want an education about space? Watch out. And that's not a lighthearted show either. They go, she goes deep on how that whole space thing got rolling. Great show. Oops, that's interesting. It went to the dictionary. How does that work? All kinds of buttons are going crazy. Karen Carpenter, Merry Christmas. Isn't that nice? Well, we're getting there, and that's going to be a fantastic Christmas. Thank you very much. Yay, says Andrew. I like that. Andrew B. Thought Drifter. There's a great name. I'm there, says JJ. Hey, it's Sean in Summerlin. Yes, Sean. I'm telling you, you got the secrets there, and I want them. It's all about Howard Hughes. Truth Raider. Olivia Wings girl. Look at you out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Happy Holy Days. Catherine Harris. It's great to see you out there. Scarlet Fire. Deeper than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. That's someone who knows the country. Bernie Mac. Good job, Dark Man in Black. I like that. You guys are outstanding. And the ideas room, by the way, was just rocking tonight. Fantastic questions. The nuclear fusion announcement. That's interesting. I'm still trying to see why they let that one out. So I'll have an answer for you. Maybe not this show, but next one around. Ask me that one again, because I've been looking at that. I've been trying to get some good people to give me some insight. Thanks, everyone. Hope you get more coal from Santa this year, or more than coal from Santa. Yeah, people are in a good holiday Santa mood. Bring on the, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Come on. Rehoboth, you bet she's out there. Yes, I think you're right. Happy holidays, DJ and Olivia. Michael Watson, thank you, sir. Wow. Jason May, Elsie, Bill Ferry, the man, the myth. He's there. Hey, DJ and Olivia. Be good to catch up. 108. Great stuff, DJ. Thank you very much. Outstanding. Great crowd tonight. Great.
Wow.
Great
What a
comments.
great idea for show. Do an all-stars of disinfo show one day.
Well, you'd have John
Legends
Brennan.
of disinfo.
John Brennan would be right at the top of that pile. And I guess everyone in TTSA. Bernie Mac, Brad Briggs. Who else we got? I'm on a serious shout out binge. Good night, all. Najat Madre. Good night.
Hey,
Najat.
do you have my blue chicken?
I do.
Do you want to
I'm
bring
going
it
to
up?
save it though, because I'm going to use that because there's a reason. And I'll explain that. Super big, awesome thanks. And that is Jason May. Fantastic. Erica Swanson Elliott. Fantastic. Erica, it's great to see you out there. And Whitney Webb, right. Yep, she's coming up tomorrow night. And what a delight she is. We will see you all tomorrow night. And it's fantastic to have so many of you here. And remember, with JFK, President Kennedy died a hero, in fact, fighting these forces. And, never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. We'll see you all tomorrow night.
Okay.
And, it says end broadcast, but after all, never really ends.
Nope.
Have a great night, everyone.
Okay. God bless.
God bless President Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.